Welcome back for today's episode. Please click the like button and leave a comment down below what time it is, wherever you are right now. It would be very helpful. Let's get to it. A prominent banker is found in his South Florida condo, stabbed nearly 40 times and bludgeoned with a glass object. No forced entry, no weapon left behind. Just a shocking crime scene that screamed of rage rather than random burglary. Who could hate Jacques Mossler enough to kill him this brutally? And why did suspicion so quickly fall on his glamorous wife Candace and her much younger lover? This case wasn't just a murder. It became one of America's most notorious scandals. In the early hours of June 30th, 1964, police officers walked into a luxury condo in Key Biscayne and found themselves at one of the most disturbing scenes they had seen in Miami's history. On the floor of the apartment, Jacques Mossler, a successful banker, lay dead. He hadn't simply been stabbed. His body bore nearly 40 separate knife wounds. Even more troubling, whoever carried out the attack had continued after death, using a heavy glass object to strike his head. It wasn't quick. It wasn't clean. It was a killing filled with fury. The apartment itself looked strangely untouched. Furniture remained in place, drawers weren't ransacked, and valuables sat undisturbed. For the officers staring down at Jacques' body, the carnage and the surroundings did not match. In ordinary burglaries, thieves often move quickly, leaving chaos behind. A busted lock, pried window, missing jewelry, or cash something showing that the motive was profit. Here, locks were intact, the door showed no marks, and expensive items remained right where Jacques had left them. That told the officers this was not an intruder, stumbling in off the street. This crime was staged in a way that suggested access through trust, not through force. The brutality stood out in another way. Nearly 40 stab wounds is not the work of someone simply trying to silence or rob. That kind of rage suggests anger, an intensely personal motivation. Defensive wounds could not save Jacques from what came at him in repeated blows. To strike a man that many times and then continue after he was gone shows a drive that goes far deeper than self-gain. The attack almost certainly pointed to someone who wanted not only to kill Jacques, but to make a statement through violence. Officers examined the bludgeoning marks more closely. A glass item, later identified as a decorative object in the apartment, had been used against his body after he had died. This was not the kind of symbolic warning seen in organized crime scenes, where a message might be carefully designed. Instead, this was messy, almost frenzied, as though whoever wielded that glass was consumed in the moment. It suggested personal hate, a kind of vengeance too intense to come from a stranger. Police scribbled notes, already asking themselves, who had the kind of fury that would turn this elegant Key Biscayne apartment into a butchered crime scene? As dawn approached, detectives catalogued what was present and what was missing. The most striking absence was the murder weapon itself. No knife surfaced, neither in the condo nor in surrounding areas. A killer had taken the time to remove the instrument of violence while leaving behind money and gold. Again, this stood against the usual logic of burglary, or a crime gone wrong in a financial dispute. If someone hired muscle to silence a banker, efficiency would have driven the act. 1 or 2 wounds, an exit, and the victim left where he fell. But this, with 40 stab wounds and an improvised post-mortem weapon, belonged in a different category altogether. Questions began to stack up. How had the killer entered? Who had access without leaving signs of forced entry? Was Jacques expecting a visitor that evening? Or had someone inside let the attacker in? With no scuff marks on the door frames and no windows broken, most investigators believed the victim had known his attacker. It isn't often a murderer carries on in such fury, unless bonds were twisted by betrayal, resentment, or some deep grudge. The evidence inside those walls strongly supported that theory. Detectives tested their thinking against patterns they knew from past cases. Contract killings almost never look this way. They are brisk, clinical, meant to leave as little evidence as possible. Burglary killings often come with a chaotic environment, ransacked drawers, or valuables gone. Those typical molds didn't hold here. Instead, as police considered everything laid out before them, an image sharpened. This wasn't random luck bringing a killer to Jacques' home. It was deliberate. The silence of the condo further raised alarm. Neighbors hadn't noticed a noisy break-in during the evening, and no one described shattering glass or panicked cries that might come with a stranger forcing entry. Whoever did this slipped in quietly and either caught Jacques unaware or walked in under the veil of familiarity. The number of stab wounds, together with the bludgeoning afterwards, matched perfectly with the notion that the victim trusted the assailant at least enough to be near him before the first blow struck. Every missing piece, only confirmed the direction their investigation needed. No missing valuables, no foreign prints identifying a stranger, and no sign of anyone crawling in by force. It was a puzzle where all signs pointed towards someone who had the right to walk across that threshold without suspicion. Detectives, speaking in low tones, knew immediately that this line of inquiry circled back, not to distant enemies, but to Jacques' personal circle. The horror of the Key Biscayne condo on that morning was not only in the wounds covering Jacques' body, but in what those wounds implied. They implied rage fueled by some long-building resentment. They suggested betrayal, as sharp as the knife used again and again. They demanded investigators stop thinking of thieves in alleyways and instead turn their eyes toward the individuals closest to him. For friends, business partners, or family, the fortune Jacques controlled could tempt jealousy or naked ambition. But among them, who would dare? By the time the body was removed, officers already had formed the structure of their case. The crime was targeted, not random. It was executed under circumstances, allowing safe entry into a locked apartment. It ended with excessive violence that showed emotion, not efficiency, and while the general public might imagine masked intruders, those picking over the crime scene knew in their gut, this was the result of deadly intimacy. Someone close to Jacques had ended his life in an eruption of hate. The investigation from that point forward rested on one overriding question. It wasn't, was this random? Because they had decided it was not. It wasn't, what was taken? Because nothing valuable had been taken. The true question became both sharper and darker. Within the ranks of Jacques' family, his associates, or those invited into his private life, who had reason to stand over him with a knife and keep striking long after his body gave way, that single question would guide every next step. And soon, as detectives pressed further, one specific possibility began to rise above the rest. In asking who benefited most from Jacques Mossler's death, investigators found themselves looking not at strangers in Miami's streets, but at the people closest to the banker's home and fortune. Before Miami's headlines, this story began far from beaches and high-rises. It started in Buchanan, Georgia, a town of dirt roads, church picnics, and small farmhouses. In the early 1920s, a girl named Candace Weatherby was born there into a family with modest means. For a child in the South at that time, paths were limited. Most girls grew up to raise families near home, and opportunities stretched only as far as local schools and small-town jobs. But Candace saw her surroundings differently. She took in the quiet streets and the limited choices, and seemed to know early on she didn't want to stay in them. She was not born into wealth or influence. Buchanan's families, including hers, lived simply. Small farms or simple wage work paid the bills, and education often took a back seat to daily labor. But from a young age, those around Candace noticed her eye for presentation. She paid attention to clothes, posture, and how to carry herself. Even as a young woman, she appeared to believe that how the world saw her mattered as much as where she came from. That belief in reinvention would stay with her for the rest of her life. While some her age helped on farms or worked in shops, Candace began looking for opportunities outside Buchanan. She read magazines that showed women in New York and Chicago wearing elegant dresses, smiling in advertisements, and appearing in glamorous pages. The contrast to Georgia life couldn't be sharper. At the time, modeling schools and finishing programs were drawing women who wanted to rise socially. Candace, still in her 20s, gravitated toward them. The classes weren't just about clothes. They taught voice, manner, and even how to enter a room with confidence. To a girl raised among wooden porches and dirt pathways, these skills seemed like stepping stones to another life. The decision to seek training outside her hometown shows how determined Candace was. Most women in her place might not have left, or even dreamed of leaving. But she tried modeling, not because she was already part of that world, but because she wanted to enter it. That shift was crucial. She wasn't waiting for someone else to open doors. She was trying to find handles to pull them open herself. It was a slow process, far from the lights she had seen in magazines, but it marked the first steps of her self-creation. Stories from her younger years describe her as charismatic, able to hold attention with ease. She wasn't shy about introducing herself to people she thought could help her climb. That boldness was not always welcomed in towns where humility was prized, but when framed with charm, it often worked in her favor. Candace didn't just want to move up. She practiced it, crafted it, and adjusted herself constantly in pursuit of something bigger. In many ways, the path she chose used her natural ambition more than her background. She experimented with modeling jobs and signed up for personal improvement schools that stressed image and presence. Fashion was more than appearance. It became her way of rewriting where she came from. Instead of working with what was given, she reshaped the narrative. Small-town birth could become forgotten detail if replaced by glamorous storylines. But ambition alone wasn't enough. Connections mattered. For Candace, meeting the right people was just as critical as shaping herself. She learned how parties and gatherings acted as gateways into higher social circles. She made herself visible in rooms where introductions mattered, where chance meetings could eventually link her to wealthier communities. This was networking long before the word became common. At the time, it was pure social leverage, and Candace took to it naturally. Over the years, her effort began showing results. She adapted dress, speech, and posture to fit into circles larger than her beginnings. She joined charity causes, supported events, and positioned herself as someone useful in high society once she reached pieces of it. These weren't merely hobbies. They acted as tickets to climb each rung of the ladder. When society women invited her in, she knew how to stay in their orbit. She became the type of figure who was hard to ignore, not because she was born into privilege, but because she styled and disciplined herself into it. To rise from Buchanan's simplicity to Houston's elite neighborhoods required resilience. This wasn't a smooth transition. Every step meant careful presentation and constant effort to avoid slipping back into the shadows of her roots. But she continued, building an image brick by brick, with persistence not unlike the white-knuckle grip of climbing a rope, never letting go. She used ambition as a lifeline, and the higher she climbed, the less she resembled the quiet girl from Georgia's small farms. By the end of the 1940s, her efforts connected her to Jacques Mossler, a banker whose success was anchored in Houston. Jacques was wealthy, established, and represented everything Candace had worked toward. His world was not about struggling farmhouses. It was about river oaks, luxury cars, philanthropic circles, and private clubs. To Candace, marrying Jacques meant she had achieved her long-sought transformation. She had secured her place among Houston's highest families. In 1949, she officially entered that world as his wife. The girl once shaping herself in fashion schools now appeared at charity galas in designer gowns. Her name appeared in social columns. She wasn't just welcomed at exclusive tables, she hosted them. Guests admired her ability to organize, to give generously, and to appear perfectly styled at each event. Those who remembered her past might have seen the leap as impossibly wide, but by then, her reinvention was complete. She was no longer Candace Weatherby from Buchanan. She was Candace Mossler of River Oaks, and still, no ladder is climbed without strain. Transitioning into Houston's elite brought visibility, but it also brought pressure. Houston society placed importance on appearances, and appearances had to be maintained at all times. Jacques Mossler's circle was filled with businessmen who valued image, success, and control. Candace, though now part of that world, carried her own ambitions and instincts. She had succeeded in transforming herself, but keeping that place demanded more, especially when cracks began to appear at home. The marriage to Jacques solidified Candace's climb, but it also set the stage for the struggles that would grow behind the curtains of wealth. She had obtained what she wanted: status, name, and position. But the life she built was about to collide with personal desires, stronger than cocktail parties and charity events, because while society saw an elegant wife at the side of a powerful banker, inside that home, tensions rose. Those cracks, small at first, would widen into scandals large enough to shake not only Houston, but the entire country. To Houston society, Jacques and Candace Mossler appeared to embody success. They lived in River Oaks, the city's most exclusive neighborhood, in homes that signaled wealth without needing explanation. Their household included 4 adopted children, completing the picture of a stable and prosperous family. To neighbors and business associates, the family looked ideal. Jacques' financial achievements gave them the base, while Candace's social charm added the color. The two together reinforced a narrative friends wanted to believe. Discipline matched to glamour, work paired with generosity, and tradition balanced with modernity. Jacques had built his reputation carefully. He was a banker, skilled at making precise decisions that expanded his influence inside Houston's growing business scene. Banking in post-war Texas meant steady growth, and Jacques positioned himself at the center of that. He handled investments and financial strategies for clients who trusted his conservative style. That reputation fed his fortune and gave him seats at boards and private clubs where influence circulated freely. His life was structured, his movements considered. He was the kind of figure who could win respect without raising his voice. At home in River Oaks, the Mosslers cultivated an image of sophistication. The house itself was elegant, generously sized, designed to host gatherings for those who carried weight in the city. Guests saw manicured lawns and carefully decorated rooms. The children played a role too, symbolizing stability in a family that appeared tightly bound to traditional values. To the outside world, the picture was clear. This was the lifestyle that came with success, prudence, and social standing. Yet behind the polished exterior, the atmosphere was more strained. The widely admired wealth and family structure masked tensions that circulated privately. Candace, while admired as a hostess, had different ambitions from her husband. She thrived in philanthropy, visible charitable support, and public events that brought cameras and recognition. For her, appearances weren't just symbols of success, but essential tools of identity. She needed to be seen, heard, and admired, and she placed herself in circles where attention followed. Jacques, on the other hand, valued restraint. He was cautious in business and equally controlled in his private dealings. Where Candace moved boldly into social networks, Jacques often preferred the quieter company of numbers and responsibilities. He wanted his influence felt through measured accomplishment. This contrast between them created strain. In rooms filled with socialites, Candace sparkled, but Jacques sometimes stood apart, less engaged, more fixed on maintaining balance rather than drawing attention. As their lives grew more visible, subtle whispers also grew louder. In Houston, elite circles thrived on appearances, but they also thrived on gossip. Stories of infidelity began to ripple beneath their polished domestic image. While not confirmed in public, those whispers placed a crack in their reputation. Even unsourced rumors mattered in a society where perception held power. Attending parties and events required constant vigilance, because power in Houston during the 1950s and 1960s often depended on staying flawless in other people's eyes. Among Jacques' relatives, the couple was seen differently than society at large. Family often described Jacques as disciplined, a man devoted to careful judgment, someone for whom risk was the great enemy. He followed routines, balanced accounts, and stayed measured. Candace was seen as his opposite, flamboyant, restless, and eager to stretch limits. She didn't simply enjoy parties and gatherings, she lived through them. The gap between the two was stark when seen up close. Beyond the photographs in newspapers, those who knew them privately could sense it. The tension was less about wealth and more about values. Jacques carried himself as a businessman who had worked to place himself firmly among Houston's financial elite. Candace, however, traded as much on charm as on resources, escalating her reach through visibility. Their goals converged at points. Both needed the appearance of stability and prestige, but the ways they chose to maintain it split apart. Jacques looked inward, Candace outward. These differences made their union less seamless than it appeared, and sharpened the contrast between restraint and flourish. Their adopted children added another dimension. To the public, they strengthened the view of a happy household. To the parents, they meant added obligations to align their lives in a way that seemed consistent. Appearances mattered even more for the children, because Houston society judged harshly. A wealthy home without children could provoke questions, while with them, it suggested completion. That narrative was valuable, but inside the house, the partnership remained uneasy. Adding to the strain were the expectations of River Oaks itself. In Houston's most exclusive neighborhood, every lawn was trimmed, every event mattered, and every family carried a quiet weight of competition. To be noticed for good reasons brought advantage, but to be noticed for failings carried costs. Candace knew how to play this environment well. Jacques did not ignore it, but he didn't treat it as essential. The couple's different perceptions of these pressures both bound them together and kept them at odds. Social appearances formed an economy of their own, and Candace operated inside it with skill. She managed parties, made connections between different groups, and presented herself in ways that heightened the Mosslers' influence. Charity work was strategic. Donations placed her name in programs and newspapers. Hosting prominent figures positioned her in social maps that mattered in Houston. For Jacques, this meant tolerating gatherings as part of the broader need to reinforce stability. Yet to him, business success was the true measure. In this difference lay the seeds of conflict. Candace's identity required being visible, Jacques required being guarded. Outside observers often failed to notice the distinction right away. They saw what the couple wanted them to see: two successful figures, partners in wealth and family life. But those closer to them described small but visible signs of disagreement. Jacques sometimes resisted her scheduling. Candace sometimes pushed beyond his conservative instinct. He managed in numbers, she managed in people. The imbalance didn't destroy them immediately, but created a steady undercurrent of division. The whispers of infidelity only deepened suspicion. Was Candace restless because public attention was not enough? Was Jacques withdrawing further because the home no longer matched his expectations? These were the kinds of questions friends and relatives quietly asked but rarely dared to voice openly. Rumors could destroy reputations, and reputations in Houston were currency. Still, suspicion lingered, waiting for evidence. What held the marriage together through those years was not unity, but necessity. Both relied on the appearance of stability. Jacques needed Candace's social presence to soften his narrow banker's image, while Candace needed Jacques' wealth and position to maintain her high-profile lifestyle. Together, they gave Houston an image it wanted, even when privately divided. It was a power exchange disguised as partnership. The deeper truth of their household was a struggle for control. Jacques built external structures around precision and discipline. Candace built internal fires around social ambition and influence. In combining them, they locked into a fragile balance. But balance requires careful handling, and the strain showed. When Candace slipped, arguments surfaced. The power struggle became less hidden, more present, though still unseen by most outside the gates of River Oaks. So while neighbors saw two people who seemed almost untouchable in their position, inside the home a challenge brewed. It wasn't raw hostility every moment, but rather a constant tension between two people using each other for different ends. Jacques used Candace to ward against appearing invisible in society circles. Candace used Jacques to solidify her place within them. The needs aligned enough for outsiders to believe in an elegant portrait, yet that portrait was fragile, ready to fracture once more powerful forces entered their lives. And into this already uneasy household, a new figure arrived. A troubled young man, introduced as Jacques' nephew, soon took up space in their circle. His name was Melvin Lane Powers, and his presence would set in motion everything waiting to break. He was introduced to Houston as a nephew in need of steadiness. Melvin Lane Powers came from little stability, and when family described him at that time, they often pointed to a boy who struggled to find footing in almost every sense. Born in 1942, his early years were marked not by comfort but by difficulty. His home life was unsettled, and the structure needed to shape him into a steady young man often escaped him. Teachers saw a student who did not stay on track, and by adolescence, his name was already linked with brushes against the law. Small offences, poor decisions, and a drift toward trouble defined the early picture. The pattern suggested a youth either unwilling or unable to map out a reliable future. That shaky start led to an uncertain young adulthood. He bounced between jobs, trying to find income that would support him, but rarely sticking to one path for long. Work on construction crews, brief forays into sales, talks about ideas with quick profit schemes, all appeared in his history. He had difficulty following through, often leaving behind unfinished plans before moving on to the next one. That uncertainty was paired with something else, though, which became clear to those who met him. Charisma. Melvin knew how to talk to a crowd, how to lock eyes in a way that suggested boldness, and how to project ambition far beyond his years. For some, this was disarming. For others, it was almost magnetic. It was around this time that Jacques Mossler entered the picture. Jacques learned of his nephew's trouble and believed he could help guide him toward a respectable role within the family orbit. Jacques had achieved success through discipline, long hours, and careful planning. For him, Mel's reckless energy must have appeared as something that could be corrected by bringing the young man into Houston's structured social and professional setting. He extended an invitation few unsteady young men could imagine, to join a world defined by wealth and order. Inside the Mossler household, Melvin had a seat at the table, proximity to luxury, and most importantly, exposure to people who had already secured a place far above his beginnings. What Jacques may not have predicted was how smoothly Melvin would adapt. The young man, once stumbling in jobs and minor crime, carried himself with sudden confidence in affluent settings. He learned quickly how to navigate dinners, recognize influential names, and attach himself to conversations that mattered. Jacques might have meant to reform him, but what Melvin found was an environment rich for personal advancement. He absorbed more than caution, he focused on opportunity. Each introduction felt like a doorway, each gathering became a test he believed he could pass with charm instead of discipline. Candace Mossler watched this transformation closely. She had spent years crafting her own public self, rising from a rural farmhouse into a Houston mansion by cultivating her image. In Melvin, she recognized qualities Jacques did not offer. Where Jacques was reserved, Melvin laughed easily. Where Jacques kept his distance, Melvin leaned forward with undivided attention. He brought energy into rooms, not calculation. For a woman who craved admiration and excitement, this mattered. She saw someone more in tune with the fire she still carried. and their connection began to deepen beyond the boundaries of an aunt and nephew. At first, to outside observers, the bond looked familial. Candace acted the supportive figure, offering encouragement and helping to fasten Melvin securely into the household. But in private, the dynamic shifted. The two began to spend more time together apart from Jacques. Mel shared his ambitions with Candace, who understood the language of aspiration better than most. Conversations stretched late, and what may have started as guidance gradually blurred toward intimacy. By the early 1960s, the private understanding between them had grown into a fully romantic affair. For Houston high society, rumors of infidelity were not unusual. Whispers circled many couples behind manicured hedges and closed doors. But what spread about Candace and Melvin struck with unusual force. This was not only the charge of a suburban affair, it was a relationship between a woman and her nephew by marriage. The word taboo hardly captured the shock it caused. In a city where perception guarded fortunes, to suggest incest, even legally removed by adoption or extended family ties, ignited scandal, and as the two carried their closeness with less caution, whispers became less avoidable. Dinner guests noticed looks that lingered too long. Neighbors described visits when Candace and Mel did not act like aunt and nephew. Letters would later confirm the intensity of their bond. In households across River Oaks, their names became topics in hushed kitchens and cornered hallways. People wondered how Jacques could tolerate it, or whether he even realized what unfolded beneath his roof. Others speculated it was only a matter of time before Candace's growing restlessness with Jacques would lead to choices no gossip could contain. For Candace, the relationship may have represented exactly what she had been searching for since her early years. A thrilling connection beyond the structures built to hold her in place. Melvin offered admiration and youth in contrast to a husband seen as cold and reserved. He filled an emotional void, even as their partnership carried a cost of secrecy and scandal. For Mel, the affair offered an anchor inside a wealthy world he had once only looked at from outside. It tied him closer to Candace's influence, and by extension, to Jacques' fortune. As suspicion mounted in Houston, the story traveled through elite circles faster than either of them could manage. It wasn't simply the impropriety of an affair. It was the boundary they crossed that magnified it into near legend among their peers. Jacques, for a time, may not have openly acknowledged what circulated, but his disciplined approach could not ignore the signs forever. Once he discovered the truth, family strain transformed into something sharper, something impossible to hide or dismiss. What began as an attempt to shelter a troubled nephew had evolved into a dangerous entanglement that disrupted every piece of the Mossler household. By the standards of wider society, the union between Candace and Melvin was more than scandalous. It was destructive. Whispers of business rivalry, inheritance motives, and jealousy soon attached themselves to the story, making it difficult to separate what was real from what was projected onto them by others. Still, the relationship was undeniable, and in Houston, it became the defining secret of their generation. This was the affair that everyone wanted to talk about, but few wanted to admit knowing. It carried the force of attraction and the threat of exposure. For Candace, who had built her public self painstakingly, it risked everything she had achieved. For Jacques, it threatened not only his marriage, but the stability of his carefully arranged life. Behind the gates of River Oaks, the scandal was powerful enough to start shifting dynamics inside the home and within the city's elite community. By 1963, the whispers had grown into something more than rumor. Jacques faced decisions about what to do with Melvin, a young man he had once tried to guide but who now represented betrayal. The household, that once seemed perfectly in place, now carried fault lines that everyone close enough could recognize. And soon, discovery would force the situation toward confrontation. Houston society had seen affairs before, but few had ever produced consequences as grave as the one between Candace and Melvin. The secrecy could not last forever, and when truth finally came to Jacques' attention, it marked a shift from social scandal into a direct threat to survival. When Jacques uncovered the intimacy between his wife and Melvin Powers, the discovery cut through every layer of the household he had tried to build. For weeks, rumors had reached his ears from different directions. Servants noticed looks and gestures that seemed out of place. Neighbors whispered about cars parked outside the mansion at odd hours. Friends hinted that Candace was paying more attention to her nephew than to her husband. Jacques, ever cautious and precise, tried to dismiss what felt like exaggerations from gossip-prone society. Yet even he could not ignore the evidence when signs appeared inside his own home. There were evenings when Jacques returned earlier than expected and found Melvin in places where family boundaries blurred. Conversations dropped into silence when he entered. Glances between the two suggested something more than familiarity. For a man who controlled his world through discipline, The uncertainty turned personal. He began asking questions quietly, watching, confirming what society whispers had already suggested. The answers he uncovered pointed straight to betrayal. At that point, observation turned into certainty, and certainty turned into rage. Jacques, usually careful not to chase conflict, reacted with uncharacteristic decisiveness. His tolerance reached a limit. Once he understood the depth of the relationship between Candace and Melvin, he acted swiftly. He told Melvin to leave the River Oaks home and made it clear that his presence in the family mansion was no longer acceptable. What had begun as an effort to guide a struggling nephew now ended with an eviction carried out under scandalous circumstances. For Melvin, this meant humiliation. For Jacques, it meant severing a connection that had betrayed his household. The eviction sent waves through the family circle. For relatives, the situation was more than awkward. It stained the Mossler name with whispers that no amount of wealth could completely silence. Jacques' decision to cast Melvin out underscored the seriousness of what had been uncovered. Guests who once praised the family unity now spoke more carefully, aware that something had fractured. Close friends of the couple realized that whatever harmony existed before had collapsed under the weight of an intimacy that no marriage could tolerate. Candace did not accept her husband's decision quietly. Reports from that time describe a woman outraged by what she saw as heavy-handed punishment. For her, Jacques' eviction of Melvin was not just about household order, it was an attack on the man with whom she had already aligned much of her emotional energy. Loyalty toward Melvin ran strong, and Jacques' act felt to her like betrayal in its own right. The rift between husband and wife, once covered with appearances, stretched open for all who looked closely. The fight did not remain limited to private quarrels. It spilled into larger decisions about where Jacques would spend his time and how much space he wanted between himself, his wife, and his nephew. Seeking distance, Jacques began to spend more time in Miami, where he had additional properties. The move acted as a retreat, but also a line of defense. In Miami, he could separate himself from Candace and Melvin, keeping the scandal and disruption at a distance while he decided what to do next. The Florida condo provided him not just shelter, but a form of exile from the chaos that had taken over his River Oaks home. Jacques' view of Melvin was now permanently changed. The man he had once hoped to guide as a troubled relative had shown himself to be, in Jacques' eyes, a threat. No longer a protégé or family responsibility, Melvin became the enemy inside the gates. Jacques believed his nephew had violated the household from within, and had done so by exploiting the very generosity intended to help him. The sense of betrayal was consuming, leaving Jacques no option but to view Melvin as someone dangerous to his home, his marriage, and potentially even his fortune. Candace's loyalty, however, only deepened. Instead of turning back toward Jacques, she moved further toward Melvin. The eviction and Jacques' anger only tied her more firmly to her nephew. Arguments between husband and wife grew sharper, each side refusing to yield. To Candace, Melvin was more than company. He was the mirror of her own restlessness, someone who spoke the language of admiration and ambition that Jacques no longer gave. She showed her allegiance by staying close to Melvin, regardless of the consequences. This drew lines across the marriage that could not be erased. The fracture was now complete. Jacques had separated himself physically by spending increasing time in Miami, but the emotional separation was far greater. The marriage became less about partnership and more about survival under the same name. He maintained his financial empire and reputation, yet the household no longer supported him in the way he expected. Candace and Melvin stood on the other side, already shaping themselves as a pair that contrasted entirely with Jacques' restraint. In the background stood the fortune. Jacques' wealth was not an abstract number. It was embodied in estates, business interests, and real investments spread across states. Whoever controlled it after his death would have access to a kind of security rarely seen. This reality amplified every conflict inside the family. Jacques knew his resources made him a target. After all, financial disputes often hardened into violence in the circles he observed. But now, the suspicion went deeper. Would his nephew and his wife's loyalty to that nephew become a direct danger? By forcing Melvin out, Jacques believed he had protected his home. By retreating to Miami, he believed he had shielded his personal life from humiliation. Yet the truth was less secure. The anger smoldered, and the rivalry within his own family had reached a point where reconciliation seemed impossible. Both Candace and Melvin were blocked by Jacques' stance, yet they both knew where the true power resided. It was in the banker's wealth, the inheritance that would eventually move from his control to another's. The eviction, meant as a punishment, instead cemented loyalties in ways Jacques had not anticipated. Candace aligned herself more openly with Mel. The marriage dissolved into hostility. Jacques only pulled further back into privacy and exile. The lines were drawn, and within those lines stood not only hurt feelings but access to immense financial resources. Both sides understood that as long as Jacques lived, he held the power. Neither side backed down. What had begun as whispers of scandal in Houston society had turned into open warfare inside the Mossler household. Jacques had seen betrayal and reacted with force, but his action left the fortune exposed as the most tempting prize. To Candace and Melvin, Jacques' death would mean freedom as well as control of wealth. To Jacques, survival now meant protecting more than reputation. It meant holding on to life itself against the people closest to him. He had moved to Miami to shield himself, but distance would not save him, because in less than a month after pushing Melvin out, Jacques Mossler was found dead in Key Biscayne, killed with a violence that looked personal rather than random intrusion. On June 29th, 1964, choices were made that ended with Jacques Mossler lying dead on his Key Biscayne floor before sunrise. That evening, Jacques stayed in his apartment, a quiet retreat from the chaos his marriage had become. He was living alone there in Miami, while Candace explained that she had taken sick nearby. She told friends and doctors that she spent the night at a hospital, plagued by migraines that made her unavailable. For detectives later piecing together the threads, her absence at that precise time stood out. Melvin Powers, meanwhile, had made a sudden trip from Houston to Miami. He arrived on a one-way ticket that afternoon, calling little attention to himself at first, but leaving a trail investigators would quickly seize upon. To travel alone with only a single direction purchased, with no return in place, carried implications that were impossible to ignore later. At the time, though, his movement passed without open challenge. He slipped from one city into another, his destination fixed on the same place where Jacques had sought distance from him. Jacques moved through his evening without knowledge of what gathered around him. The condo was familiar, calm, with his ordinary habits still unbroken. He read, took calls, and prepared for a night alone. To neighbors, there was nothing unusual. He appeared as a man maintaining his private existence, but in truth, others were circling closer, while the night stretched longer. Melvin's movements during those hours formed a pattern that later drew sharp questions. Reports placed him at Miami bars, seated as if he wanted to appear visible in public. He borrowed a car linked to business interests of the Mosslers, a detail that mattered when police began reconstructing his night. He seemed to leave behind just enough to place himself socially but not securely. It was a strange mix of exposure and secrecy. If it was meant to serve as an alibi, the pieces did not line up cleanly, and that mismatch would haunt him once events became public. As for Candace, she was officially checked into the hospital. Doctors, nurses, and records confirmed her presence, but according to detectives, the precise timing of her stays, her complaints of migraine pain, and the moments she left her room made her statement only partly convincing. When officers sought her account after Jacques' death, she was not immediately reachable. Her explanation was that her health had isolated her. Yet the coincidence that her husband was murdered while she was less than a mile away in medical care raised questions to which answers never came easily. By morning, neither alibi seemed fixed. Melvin's trip from Houston and his shifting locations in Miami looked suspicious. Candace's medical stay placed her inconveniently unavailable when police looked for her. People with steady explanations could not easily be linked to what happened in Jacques' condo, but both their stories carried holes. The killing itself showed few holes in intent. Jacques suffered 39 separate stab wounds, an act far beyond what was needed to end a man's life. Whoever attacked him carried not just a knife, but the will to use it again and again in a frenzied burst of violence. And when that ended in death, the violence continued. A glass object in the home was used to strike him further, post-mortem, as though rage had not been spent even after life left him. The attack bore no marks of burglary. The door locks were clean, valuables remained on shelves and tables, and only his body showed disruption. Police who arrived at dawn found no random intruder to blame. The picture instead looked targeted, deeply personal, and bound to someone who both knew Jacques and could walk into his home without breaking barriers. In Key Biscayne, crime was not common. Random killings by strangers were rare. Here, the details forced detectives into a smaller circle, shaped by family and immediate acquaintances. A pattern of betrayal and emotion emerged from the very brutality displayed. The timeline grew clearer. Jacques ended June 29th as a man unaware of looming danger. By midnight, his nephew was moving through Miami bars, placing himself in public, while staying just close enough to the Key Biscayne condo. Candace remained at the hospital, claiming migraines but unable to answer questions about her availability. Sometime between Jacques' quiet evening and the early dawn, the attack erupted inside his home, unseen but leaving devastation that could not be hidden. The injuries showed not calculation but passion. 39 stab wounds do not come from efficiency. They come from fury, guided by something personal rather than professional. After the last cut, the blows with glass followed, sealing that impression in blood and shattered fragments. It was this kind of excessive violence that hardened police belief. This was no accident, no mistaken burglary, no faceless stranger. It was an eruption between people who shared far stronger ties. When detectives followed the early trail, suspicion centered almost immediately. Jacques' estranged wife had been near but claimed illness. His nephew had traveled suddenly and alone without preparing for a return. Each appeared to stand outside at the very moment of his death. Each had reasons others would later point to as motive, and for investigators, both together stood to inherit access to fortune if Jacques was no longer in the picture. By sunrise, Jacques Mossler's life was over, ended in his own home by an assailant who left no forced entry, no theft, and no stability in place for the family that remained. The message of the killing was clear in its method. It was about resentment, anger, and betrayal. While the world outside still woke to an ordinary Miami morning, police carried the news that a wealthy banker had been stabbed dozens of times in his Key Biscayne condo. The secrecy of the night had masked it, but the savagery of the aftermath made it impossible to treat as anything other than deliberate murder. Attention shifted almost immediately to those who, by circumstance and by gain, belonged at the center of suspicion. Jacques' glamorous wife, spending the night nearby but refusing questions at dawn, his troubled nephew, who had left Houston on a single ticket only hours before the attack. Together, they formed the picture investigators saw more clearly with every step into the case. For Miami police, the brutal night was not solved in its first hours, but the outlines of the solution were visible. Jacques' death came tied to those who stood closest to him in life, not strangers in shadows. Candace and Melvin remained at the edge of every early suspicion as the investigation prepared to move forward. What did police actually find tying Candace Mossler and Melvin Powers to the savage murder in Key Biscayne? The puzzle they faced had clear gaps. No weapon was recovered, no witness could describe the attacker, and the scene left behind seemed more private than public. With no clear physical proof in their hands, detectives had to build their case through the fragments left behind. The first fragment was a print. When officers wiped down surfaces in Jacques Mossler's apartment, one of the strongest impressions lifted from the kitchen belonged to Melvin. At first glance, it could have been explained away. He had lived in that house before, during more welcoming days, but investigators pressed further. The specific positioning of his palm overlaying freshly cleaned surfaces nagged at them. If Melvin had been evicted months earlier, why would his print turn up in a kitchen recently scrubbed by staff? It was a starting point that pushed attention his way. Next came clothing. When detectives examined what Melvin had with him during his sudden trip from Houston, they noted faint stains that laboratory analysis confirmed as blood traces. The spots were not immediately obvious, but they were enough to trouble the police. Combined with his one-way ticket to Miami, these marks on fabric painted an uneasy story. A man accused of being too close to his aunt, traveling suddenly across states, and now spotted with the blood of a man stabbed to death. Transportation details also worked against him. The car he borrowed in Miami turned out not to be an ordinary rental, but one connected to Mossler-controlled companies. Tracing license plates and paperwork, officers saw lines reaching straight back to the banker's business interests. The choice of vehicle opened questions. Why not a normal rental? Why use a car that signaled family ties, unless he assumed comfort moving under that identity? It was another link pushing suspicion toward Melvin rather than away. With Melvin's prints, his stained clothing, and his strange decisions about travel, police already had plenty to question. His timeline looked worse under closer inspection. That single one-way ticket stood out in reports, stamped June 29, 1964. One day before Jacques was found cut down in his own condo. Authorities later pieced together that Melvin had gone to local bars that night in what may have been an effort to write an alibi. Yet the hours of his movements remained hazy, with contradictions in accounts offered from witnesses. People remembered him present, but not always consistently. The suspicion was that he was seen enough to be noticed, but not enough to be fixed in time, a strategy that felt designed rather than accidental. Candace's position in all this was harder to pin down through prints or tickets. Instead, the cracks forced open in her carefully built alibi revealed themselves in long interviews. Her decision to stay in a hospital for migraines, while her husband was butchered a mile away, raised suspicion. Records showed her entering the ward, but significant time intervals lacked clear explanation. Nurses described her symptoms with vagueness, noting she sometimes left her bed. When police came searching for her early on June 30th, she was not instantly reachable, a distance that drew suspicion rather than sympathy. Her defense lay on paper, but her presence could not be secured with certainty during the exact window of her husband's murder. What tethered Candace closer to Melvin in the eyes of investigators were the letters. Love notes meant for privacy became evidence in folders. They carried expressions of affection, frustration with Jacques, and phrasing that suggested plans for a life unchained from the banker's control. To prosecutors, these pages laid out motive. A woman tied to a nephew she desired, eager to shake loose from the husband whose existence blocked her path. Though love letters alone were not proof of conspiracy to kill, in the context of violent death they became damning symbols. Further weight came from Jacques himself. His diary was recovered with references to marital strain and suspicions directed at Candace. He noted her absences, her conflicts, and his growing discomfort with the presence of Melvin. Detectives saw in those pages the voice of a man under threat, one who documented a household on the edge of breaking. To a jury someday, the written word of a murdered man could easily colour how events were seen, especially when his suspicions echoed the evidence laid out months after his death. One final oddity complicated the forensic picture. Among reports was a Coke bottle, found broken during the cataloguing of the crime scene. Its relevance was debated, yet officers revisited it because of markings suggesting it might have been used at some stage during the violence or its aftermath. Whether wielded in anger or discarded amid struggle, the item added to the sense that Jacques had not been murdered clinically, but with whatever lay close to hand. Detectives added the Coke bottle into the narrative of excessive rage, yet whether it tied directly to Candace or Melvin remained uncertain. Step by step, investigators drew together these strands. A missing murder weapon cut sharply against the neatness of their case. The absence of witnesses left them reliant on circumstantial ties. Still, when laid out with care, the story held coherence. Melvin arrived in Miami on a one-way flight. His palm print sat fresh in Jacques' apartment. Blood appeared on his clothing. He drove a car registered to Mossler business ties. Candace, nearby, lacked a solid timeline of her hospital stay. Letters and notes proved intimacy between aunt and nephew, while Jacques' own diary documented trouble between them all. None of it was conclusive in isolation. But the picture in full detail painted not mystery but opportunity. A man estranged from his wife is found violently butchered in his apartment. His nephew, recently evicted for being involved with that wife, arrives suddenly from across the country the very same day. His wife, nearby, cannot prove her whereabouts for every crucial hour. Together, they stand to benefit immensely through inherited access and the freedom of Jacques' absence. The evidence might have lacked the neatness of a fingerprint on a knife, but the circumstantial web left little comfort for those accused. The police assembled their findings into stacks of files that told the story less of random home invasion and more of conspiracy. They argued that rage guided the weapon, that betrayal lay behind the countless stab wounds, and that greed made the outcome tolerable for those who participated. While lawyers would later dissect every line and point out gaps, the detectives who brought their folders to court believed the picture was clear. Motive, method, and opportunity aligned too well. By late 1964, authorities moved forward with charges, preparing to put Candace and Melvin on trial. The evidence trail may not have been direct, but to a state attorney in Miami, it was sharp enough to cut through doubt. The hearings promised to be filled with scandal, not only because of the murder itself, but because of what it suggested about family, loyalty, and betrayal in one of the wealthiest households in Houston. And with those steps complete, the Mossler case was set to enter a courtroom where the nation would soon turn its attention, making it one of the most sensational trials of the decade. By 1966, America's newspapers filled their front pages with the story of Candace Mossler and her nephew, Melvin Powers. The scandal of a wealthy Houston socialite accused of conspiring with her young lover to murder her banker husband was irresistible. Photographers waited at airports and courthouse steps, capturing every flash of drama as the case moved from crime scene to courtroom. Candace, stylish and controlled even under arrest, was picked up at the Miami airport wearing gloves and sunglasses, surrounded by cameras. What had started as whispers inside River Oaks society now became a national spectacle everyone wanted to follow. The arrest itself reflected just how sensational the story had become. Miami police escorted Candace through a crowd of reporters and curious onlookers, treating each step as if it carried weight far beyond her own circumstances. Melvin, too, faced his public walk into custody, his presence feeding into the idea that this was not just a standard murder case, but a tale with elements of forbidden love, betrayal, and greed. Before they reached trial, the public had already built its narrative. The accused were not just suspects. They were the central figures in a soap opera, unfolding in real time. Prosecutors framed their charges on that scandal. They told the jury that Candace, known for her glamour and public life, had manipulated her nephew into committing the brutal murder of Jacques Mossler. To them, she was not a wife holding on to dignity, but a seductress willing to cross lines of family in order to trap a younger man into doing her bidding. Melvin, they argued, was not simply an accomplice but the hand wielding the knife, driven by passion and by the promise that he and Candace would inherit Jacques' fortune. Their version turned a private marriage dispute into a conspiracy, soaked with both desire and calculation. Heading the prosecution was State Attorney Richard Gerstein. His approach was steady, careful, and evidence-based. He sifted through the layers of circumstantial proof, bringing up Jacques' diary, the letters exchanged by Candace and Melvin, and the inconsistencies in both of their alibis. He pressed the bloody clothing, the palm print, and the one-way ticket as signs of planning and guilt. His courtroom style avoided theatrics. He hoped the facts of the case, even without a recovered murder weapon, would be strong enough to carry the verdict. But the defense had selected one of the most recognizable and commanding attorneys of the time, Percy Foreman. Based in Texas, Foreman already had a reputation for his courtroom control, and the Mossler case provided him an arena unlike any other. Where Gerstein stayed focused on facts, Foreman painted pictures with his words. He compared the prosecution to stage actors, suggested that suspicion was not proof, and delivered long, dramatic speeches that pulled from history and literature. Those listening recalled Shakespearean flourishes in his closing, where he cast doubt not simply through logic, but through emotion and imagery. Foreman also shaped the jury to favor his clients. Understanding the cultural climate, he pushed for an all-male jury. His reasoning was blunt. Men might be swayed differently by a striking woman like Candace, and may not judge her relationship with Melvin as harshly as women jurors might. This decision added to the sense of strategy surrounding every part of the trial. The seating of 12 men was itself a headline. To many onlookers, the case had already turned from evidence toward theatre. Inside that theatre, testimony shook the courtroom repeatedly. Neighbours and friends were called to speak about the relationship between Candace and Melvin. Whispered suspicions of incest now became spoken allegations under oath. Letters Candace had written were read aloud, filled with emotion and longing for her nephew. The jury watched as private romance erupted into public scandal, blurring the line between criminal evidence and tabloid drama. The formality of the courtroom could not wash away the undertones of gossip. Each day's coverage carried not only what was said about the murder, but what was revealed about their relationship behind closed doors. The defense countered every witness and document with the claim that none of it added up to proof. A letter could show affection, but not conspiracy. A palm print could be old. A blood spot could come from another source. Foreman hammered constantly on the absence of a weapon, the lack of a direct eyewitness, and the holes in the investigative timeline. His arguments, often stretched through long monologues, took hold with jurors less interested in connecting small dots than in finding certainty. What further distinguished the case were the theatrics around Candace herself. She attended hearings, impeccably dressed, smiling, and sometimes appearing unfazed by the severity of the charges. Public opinion wondered if she was performing, but jurors watched her in real time. The role she played in the courtroom seemed less like a terrified widow and more like a confident woman resisting shame. Foreman leaned on this impression, shaping her as someone too strong and too obvious to carry out a murder plot. He painted her as a convenient scapegoat for police, who could not solve a crime with conventional evidence. As the arguments closed, each side presented their version of truth. Gerstein listed the evidence methodically, explaining how each piece tied to motive and opportunity. He returned again and again to Jacques' diary, to the glaring 40 stab wounds, and to the trip Melvin had made across states. Foreman ended with drama, filling his statements with flourishes intended not just to persuade, but to leave an impression of grandeur. His final words, echoing classical style, reminded jurors of the dangers of condemning without certainty. The contrast could not have been sharper, one man appealing to reason, the other to emotion. The jury, 12 men selected carefully, retired with stacks of documents and days of scandal ringing in their ears. Outside, crowds gathered in anticipation, treating verdict day like the closing of a show. When the decision came, it stunned the public. Despite months of evidence, weeks of scandalous testimony, and years of suspicion, the jury returned not guilty for both Candace Mossler and Melvin Powers. Reporters rushed out of the courthouse to file their stories. Headlines declared victory for the defense, shock for the prosecution, and disbelief for onlookers who expected conviction. The trial, already one of the most closely followed of the decade, now stood as a marker of how public spectacle could shape private justice. The scandal did not end with those two words. Instead, it secured the Mossler name firmly in crime history. To the public, they were no longer only suspects in a brutal killing. They were the figures at the center of a story that blended money, sex, betrayal, and law into the spectacle of the 1960s. If Candace and Mel thought that walking free from a Miami courtroom meant the end of their ordeal, they were mistaken. The acquittal gave them legal freedom, but it did not remove the cloud that hung over both of their lives. In Houston, where their reputations once carried weight in charity circles and among bankers, they returned as notorious figures. People still invited them to gatherings, but conversations surrounding them never escaped the scandal. They had gone from whispered subject matter in River Oaks to headlines across the nation, and returning to normal life after that trial was impossible. For Candace, re-entry into Houston society was complicated. She resumed her role as a hostess, attending galas and making donations that kept her visible in the papers. Now, though, it was not just her gowns or her generosity that drew eyes. It was the quiet reminder that she had stood trial for her husband's brutal murder beside her own nephew. Her name carried both allure and suspicion, and some doors remained closed because of it. Yet, true to her nature, she pressed on, folding notoriety into her public profile rather than letting it drive her into silence. Inside her home, the family divided. Candace's adopted children had already lived through scandal, but now they began accusing her of another betrayal. They believed she was mismanaging the trust funds Jacques had left in place for them. The children claimed their mother diverted money intended to secure their futures. These arguments grew sharper over time, dragging Candace into disputes that did not always make headlines but carved deeper cracks inside her family. The stage that once displayed her as the perfect society matron now revealed conflicts with her own children. Business became another arena where she tried to assert control. Candace experimented in banking and real estate ventures, hoping to position herself as more than a society figure. She had secured her place in Houston through Jacques, but after his death she wanted to prove she could stand independently in money-making circles. She also turned to the entertainment business, attempting to finance projects linked to singers like Judy Garland. These ventures reflected her restless energy. She wanted to keep moving forward, but many of her projects faltered under the weight of poor planning or shaky partnerships. Not every investment returned profit, and not every idea connected the way she hoped. In her personal life, Candace moved again into marriage. She wed Barnett Garrison, a man whose own flamboyance seemed a match for her. Their union filled gossip pages, but the story turned grim. In the late 1970s, Barnett was found dead on Candace's property, a gunshot wound ending his life. The official explanation pointed to suicide, but rumors swirled as they always had around Candace. The strangeness of the situation put her again in the headlines she could not escape. Even if her connection to Barnett's death was never charged or proven, the whispers only reinforced the pattern people already believed. Where Candace lived, scandal followed. Her last years showed the wear of these strained decades. Once a woman shaping herself for any room, she now faced questions she could not control. By 1976, she was found dead in her Houston apartment. The cause was an overdose, a quiet end for someone whose life had continually been punctuated by noise. She was only 57 years old. For her children and those who had watched her rise, the conclusion was tragic. What had started in a Georgia farmhouse and climbed into Houston's wealthiest neighborhood ended with isolation, disputes, and suspicion. Mel's trajectory after the trial followed its own strange arc. In contrast to Candace's fractured visibility, he leaned into construction and real estate. He built developments and sold himself as a businessman with ambition. During the 1970s, he managed to amass considerable wealth. His homes displayed taste for lavishness, with marble floors, grand staircases, and luxury cars decorating driveways. He lived large, as if audacity itself could recast his name. Houstonians remembered him as the man acquitted of his uncle's savage killing, but he pressed forward, using the very drama of his past to make his presence larger. For years, the strategy appeared to work. He portrayed himself as a developer with confidence, making headlines for deals rather than scandal. But real estate carries cycles, and Mel faced the turns of economy with heavy expenses attached. As markets worsened, his empire showed cracks. Creditors circled, investments soured, and bankruptcy filings exposed what once looked untouchable. The decline contrasted with images he had sought so carefully to maintain. He had rebuilt himself after the courtroom battle, but the erosion of his finances mirrored the erosion of his reputation. Both came crashing back after time. Through the decades, Mel carried himself as though defiance alone would hold. He partied, built, and sometimes flaunted his wealth, but the shadow of 1964 never completely lifted. Any story covering him, no matter how far removed, always returned to Miami. The brutality then, and the scandal afterward, had fixed his identity in history. Friends and business partners saw his drive, but reporters and historians could not resist tying every later headline to the trial that once shocked America. His story stretched far longer than Candace's into the new century. But in 2010, Melvin Powers was found dead at 72 in his Houston mansion. Unlike Jacques or Barnett, there was no violence, only the quiet end of a man who had once been the youngest and most infamous figure of a family scandal. His wealth had declined, his empire reduced compared to its prime, but the name still carried weight, if only because of the extraordinary case in which he had stood accused. Together, Candace and Mel's lives after the trial tell a matching story. Both gained their freedom but lost the possibility of ever escaping their reputations. Candace ended her days in Houston, overdosed at 57, remembered just as much for her scandals as for her society roles. Mel stretched his narrative longer, rising into real estate prominence only to see decline wreck it, ending his life still marked by notoriety. Neither fully shed the stain of Key Biscayne. Both remained defined by the summer of 1964, when one man's body in a Miami condo turned them into figures of rumor and history. Their acquittal spared them prison, but it did not free them from judgment. Each attempt at reinvention returned them to the same story. Their names almost never appeared without Jacques attached, and the murder that courts could not prove still wrote the story of their lives. Even in their deaths, Candace through overdose and Mel through aging decline, their endings were framed by that trial. The public never looked away, and when their obituaries appeared, the first lines always circled back to Miami. That is how the two central figures of the Mossler scandal ended their lives in notoriety, carrying with them both freedom and the weight of permanent suspicion. Their story, still circulating in documentaries, magazine features, and historical accounts, did not close with their deaths. It lived on, shaping memory as much as fact, ensuring they remained etched into the history of American crime long after they were gone. Decades later, the question still lingers. Why does the Mossler case continue to matter? Time has passed since the summer morning when police carried Jacques Mossler's body from his Key Biscayne condo, but the story never completely faded into history. Instead, it became one of those early examples of how true crime could turn into cultural theatre for the public. That transformation is why Candace Mossler and Melvin Powers are remembered, less for who they were as individuals and more for the scandal they embodied. When the trial opened in 1966, it was quickly obvious that this was not simply a legal process. Coverage by major magazines proved that point. National outlets like Time, Look, and Saturday Evening Post were not known for sensational gossip, yet they rushed to cover every moment of this trial. These were not the crime pages of a local paper either. They were part of American cultural life. Once the Mossler story filled those publications, it transformed from a Miami murder case into a national obsession. The press highlighted photographs of Candace walking into the courtroom, dressed immaculately, foregrounding her beauty and composure as much as the evidence she faced. For Melvin, they painted the portrait of a brooding young man whose role was unclear: lover, accomplice, or scapegoat. It became almost serialized entertainment. Each issue carried the latest step of the case, as though readers were following a drama on television, not a man's murder in court. It was not lost on observers that the coverage mirrored the structure of a continuing story. Background, tension, scandal, climax. The case had all of these, laid out not only by prosecutors and attorneys, but by the way media presented it. People bought copies to read about evidence, but they also bought them to catch the next chapter. This approach was an early example of what would later dominate American media, crime as spectacle. Today, it is familiar to see trials treated like staged events, watched live as though part of entertainment. In the mid-1960s, the Mossler trial showed how possible it was. Cameras did not stream the testimony, but the photographs, sketches, and descriptions in national magazines brought it into everyone's living rooms. The case set a standard. A court hearing could become as gripping as a stage play, if packed with the right ingredients: wealth, sex, family betrayal, and death. Years later, the retelling of the story continued. Investigation Discovery produced specials revisiting the trial, piecing together the drama for modern viewers who wanted to understand why this case had captured their parents' or grandparents' attention. Texas Monthly, known for its long-form explorations of crime and culture, placed the Mossler scandal in context, comparing it to other large cases in the state's history. The story's impact stretched decades because the mixture of themes remained recognizable. Every retelling reinforced how the trial stood as both a crime and a performance that revealed American fascinations clearly. Part of what made this trial unforgettable were the unforgettable lines tied to its leading players. One came from Candace herself. In interviews and reports, when asked about her private life and the rumors linking her to Melvin, she brushed them aside with the remark, "Nobody's perfect." That casual dismissal struck America like a jolt, turning her into something more than a suspect. It turned her into a cultural character. Instead of chasing denial, she replied with a line that sounded both flippant and self-aware. That single phrase followed her long after the acquittal, repeating itself in the public mind as a symbol of her persona. On the other side of the defense, Percy Foreman left lines that echoed as much as the verdict. In his role as the lawyer protecting Candace and Melvin, he used dramatic phrases and flourishes. He likened the prosecution to a pirate at sea, steering with reckless boldness rather than law. Those words, heavy with imagery, appeared in newspapers and stuck in cultural memory. People might not have remembered all the evidence presented by state attorneys, but they remembered the image of a lawyer slamming his hand down and throwing out metaphors. With those turns of phrase, lawyers learned again what showmanship could do in front of a jury. Even in death, irony followed Candace. When she passed away in 1976, she was buried beside Jacques in Arlington National Cemetery. The man she had been accused of conspiring to kill and the woman acquitted of the crime now lay together in a national military ground, framed forever by marble and history. Visitors walking through the cemetery to pay respects to servicemen would stumble across their names, puzzled at the story behind the shared stone. That placement deepened the sense that the Mosslers were not ordinary figures. Their story became part of the American landscape itself, written into an honored ground that was never meant for scandal. The reason their story stretched beyond one murder case is the way it tied into larger themes of the United States in post-war years. The 1950s and 1960s presented a nation brimming with economic growth, expanding suburbs, wealth concentrated in neighborhoods like River Oaks, and women redefining their identities within that frame. Candace embodied the tensions between expectation and expression. She came from a modest town and rose into society with willpower and self-reinvention. Jacques embodied the successful banker, serious and disciplined, the kind of man whose life was supposed to symbolize post-war stability. Melvin, younger, restless, and defiant, embodied both risk and temptation. Their mixture brought to light the subjects people avoided discussing openly: sex across taboo lines, greed within families, and power struggles behind closed doors. When combined, they presented themes stretching far beyond a Miami courtroom. They told a wider story: how appearances in wealthy America often mask dangerous fractures, how marriages upheld for society could hide deep dissatisfaction, and how media exposure could convert human tragedy into public entertainment. That is why their names survived. They were not isolated figures, but symbols of the American fascination with wealth, betrayal, and scandal itself. The payoff of their case was never only their freedom or acquittal, it was the cultural shift that followed. The Mossler trial showed the possibility of blending the framework of courtroom procedure with the tools of tabloid drama. The public did not consume it as a routine criminal case. They consumed it as a story with characters, dialogue, and themes. That pattern now echoes whenever news stations broadcast months of testimony live, or when magazines and podcasts serialize a single high-profile crime. The Mosslers lived it first, in a way early enough to surprise the nation but familiar enough to set patterns for the decades that followed. Looking back now, the Mossler story was not just another murder. It was a media landmark, blending law and culture so seamlessly that observers could not tell where coverage ended and drama began. Jacques' death in Key Biscayne mattered on its own, but the story attached grew into something America had never quite seen before. Decades later, it remains a case study in scandal, perception, and spectacle. That legacy does not belong only to 1964. It reverberates still, shaping the way scandal is consumed and remembered in America today.